Alright everybody, how are we doing today? It is time for some economic stories. Let us begin. So, in the United States, Representative Rashida Talib wants a $20 minimum wage for tipped workers that would likely destroy the restaurant industry. Days after the House passed a bill to raise federal minimum wage to $15 an hour, oh dear God, Representative Rashida Talib, a member of the much embattled squad targeted by President Donald Trump, upped the ante. Now I think it should be $20, she said. Talib was addressing an event spearheaded by the Restaurant Opportunity Center of Michigan and won fair wage, two organizations pushing for a higher minimum base pay for restaurant industry workers. While a $20 minimum wage would be problematic for a range of businesses, the restaurant industry in particular stand to lose the most from such proposals. Employees at food and drink establishments typically work on a tipped wage, an hourly base rate that is lower than the minimum wage. Those workers can make up the rest of the hourly minimum wage in tips. If gratuities fail to bring an employee's earnings to the equivalent of the minimum wage, employers are required to make up the difference. If employees make more than the hourly minimum wage in tips, they get to keep the extra income. Not only does this model of pay give wait staff the chance to accrue earnings above and beyond the minimum wage, but also allows restaurants of every variety to stay above water in an industry with profit margins around 6%. Employees who make a lot of tip also help keep the doors open and the stoves running. The federal tipped minimum is currently $2.13 an hour. Talib's proposal, which amounts to an increase of almost 940%, would spell trouble for many dining establishments, particularly those of the mom and pop variety, many of which would require a miracle to comply with Talib's proposal and stay in business. A recent study released by two researchers from Harvard University's Business School concluded that a median rated restaurant on Yelp, 3.5 stars, was 14% more likely to close with each additional dollar added to the tipped wage. The thing about minimum wage is that employers need to be able to afford to pay the minimum wage. If they have to pay their employees and pay off other things, and pay the building, run a business, you're stretching them too thin. They don't have that kind of money. Like, how much profit do you think they're raking in? A $15 minimum wage is probably gonna ruin people's lives already, or at the very least make it more complicated, because that also increased costs for employers. Businesses will go out. They will cease to exist. Some will obviously be fortunate enough to remain open, but many of their employees, may not be so fortunate. Take Manhattan, for instance, which recently hiked the city's tipped wage to $10 an hour. A corresponding survey released by the NYC Hospitality Alliance found that in response to that increase, 70% of full-service establishments will cut employee hours in 2018, and 47% will eliminate jobs entirely. And those jobs will likely belong to the most vulnerable economic group, those with the lowest skills who on paper are supposed to benefit from minimum wage increases. A 2015 study from the University of Washington shows that restaurants subjected to tipped wage hikes do away with the more menial positions in favor of high-skilled labor. A server can bust their own table, but you can't ask a busboy to open a bottle of wine and talk about what it can be paired with. Susanna Coteen, who runs Lido Restaurant in Harlem, told CBS News in January. The battle over tipped wages isn't new, with similar fights having been waged in Seattle, Washington, and Maine, among other cities and states across the country. Washington, D.C. entered the fray last summer when activists spearheaded by the Restaurant Opportunities Center and One Fair Wage passed Initiative 77, which, had it been implemented, would have eliminated the tipped wage entirely in the district. The initiative passed at the ballot box, but was overturned by the D.C. Council after an outcry from service industry professionals who objected to the law. There seems to be this myth going around that most tipped employees in restaurants aren't earning a livable wage. After 13 years in the industry, this baffles me completely, wrote Ryan Aston, a local bartender in a Washington Post op-ed. I earn roughly $45 an hour, with tips included. I don't know a single server or bartender in the district whose wages have to be supplemented because they haven't earned the minimum. Regardless, Tlaib wants a one-size-fits-all approach, one that mandates a sky-high federal wage and fails to account for specific industry needs. People cannot live on those kinds of wages, and I can't allow people to be living off tips. You know, relying on tips for wages, it's just not enough to support our families, Tlaib said at the event dubbed Server for an Hour. But if a proposal like Tlaib's were to pass, the workers she's advocating for may be out of work entirely. Yes! Because in order for businesses to survive, they would have to trim the fat in order to meet her standard. And that would involve firing people. You wouldn't, so not only would they not be getting $20 an hour or $15 an hour, they would be getting $0 an hour. Because they can't necessarily afford to pay it. These rich, sycophantic, ivory tower liberals who pretend to understand the working class don't even know a damn thing about us. Because they've been living as politicians or as rich people and living off benefits their entire lives. They've never had to work an hour in their life. I mean, good freaking grief here. This is absurd. The thing is, I don't hate rich people. They're an important part of our economy. Without them, there's no investment in businesses and inventions in order to increase our GDP. But when they pretend to understand an income bracket that they themselves have never been a part of, and they start spreading ignorance and making policies like this, if stupidity were against the law, these people would be serving a life sentence. And these left-wing politicians just don't understand economics. The Keynesians understand economics better than these people. It's obscene. I swear, I'm going to start a petition to get Rashida, to get people to not vote for Rashida Talib next election. Get her out of there. Vote for her opponent. Get her out of there. She's an idiot. And the rest of the squad is probably a bunch of idiots too. I mean, for crying out loud, they got AOC in there, for God's sake. Anyway,